podcast listeners. Ria Wong with you once again with Nonprofit Lowdown. Today I have a friend and repeat guest, Darren Isom, partner at Bridgespan, and we are going to talk about Gen X managers, Gen Z staff. What is a poor nonprofit leader to do? Darren, welcome to the show again.
Hello, hello. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I love this. Oh, and by the way, since we last spoke, you are now a podcast host yourself. You want to talk a little bit about your show?
I am a podcaster myself. How about that? I'm following your wonderful lead. So I'm leading this series, Dreaming in Color, where I get to talk with super cool leaders of color in the nonprofit, social sector space, and give them an opportunity to talk about what their vision of the future looks like and how they leverage their life experiences to live into that vision. So it's been a great opportunity for me to talk with some super cool folks. I joke all the time that the conversations are absolutely wonderful. What people cannot hear in the conversations, and luckily it's recorded in a way that they can erase all of my laughing, because I'm laughing through all of the shows. People are funny, they're wonderful storytellers. And I think there's something, just really beautiful about seeing folks that have been called to do this work. Gives me a great sense of healing. The world's an absolute mess, but we have some really talented people. I mean, our squad is deep and strong. And knowing that these folks are working on all these critical issues has been really reaffirming for me. It's been healing for me. And the conversation has been wonderful. So I hope folks get to learn from those and get to potentially contribute to them at some point as well.
I love that so much, and I'll make sure to put all of the information about that in the show notes for folks who want to listen in, which you should. It is awesome. I've been listening along, and actually, I want to tap into some of your guests. So, always fun. Okay, friend, let's pivot because you and I can like talk about all the things. I think, I mean, how many hours do we have in the day? But we last spoke and we hit upon talking about Gen X and Gen Z and some of the generational challenges. And in particular, you mentioned some of the concerns that you are seeing around, these nonprofit leaders, particularly folks of color being hired up into these leadership roles, but then not being set up for success. So I'm just going to like wind you up, let you go.
No, and feel free to jump in because I could just ramble on about this forever, and I'm sure, and it would be a fairly incoherent rattle. So please check me if I'm going off in a way that doesn't make sense. I think it's important to offer just a great deal of context with this conversation as well. And so I'm just going to put myself out there, and I'm 40. I'm throwing my age out there. It's not every gay man's not going to do this, but 46. And
You
really,
don't look a day over 30, telling you.
you are a complete liar, but I appreciate that. Your Venmo, I'll send you a tip, right? And so about 2 years ago, I joked with my husband, who's 61, that 44 was the first year that I felt old. And clearly 44 is not old. My husband's 61, which is not old. My mother's in her late 60s, which is not old. My husband's mother is 91. That is old, right? But 44 was the first year that until 44, embarrassingly, I always thought of someone who was an adult as being either about my age or just getting out of college, right? And 44, embarrassingly, was the first time I looked up and realized a 34-year-old is well out of college, definitely an adult, and not my age, right? And this 24-year-old, 24, I was living in New York, dodging falling buildings with September 11th. I was definitely an adult. That's 2 solid decades younger than I am. And so it was the first time I realized that, there were definitely other generations of adults in the
Darren,
mix.
I got to tell you, when I looked around and I realized that I was the adult in the room, I was like, oh my God, how did that happen?
And how scary for everyone involved as well when you're the adult in
I
the room.
mean, the secret is like no one knows what they're doing. Like that's a big secret, everyone. We're all just making it up as we
We're
go.
all just making
Anyway,
up as we go along.
yeah.
And so and you see it play out within the professional context. You see it also in the personal context. Like I totally remember being the child at family functions. And your parents were like the adults, and then there were grandparents lying around. And now you go home and it's your parents instead of the grandparents, and you're starting to lose them. Some of us are lucky enough to still have grandparents, right? But they're definitely off in the corner somewhere, right? And then there are kids running around, and these kids aren't real kids anymore. Like they're like, they're almost grown themselves, right?
Oh my
I'm
gosh. Wait, Darren, can
I'm
I
so worried.
pause you there? I
Yeah,
I
please.
recently went to the Breakthrough Gala, the organization that you and I
Yeah.
they're I knew them as 12-year-olds. They're 23. They're drinking wine. They're working for Goldman Sachs. I was like, what is happening? Wait,
Listen,
wait. I
I'm in Boston. I'm
You're
in
like
Boston for
12.
work. No. I'm in Boston for work, and I'm having dinner tonight with my best friend from college, the guy that I met the first day when I arrived in the dorms at Howard. He was a random guy from, South Carolina. I was coming in from New Orleans. None of us had knew anybody. Our parents dropped us off and was like, "Good luck," right? And we've been friends ever since. I'm having dinner tonight with his daughter, who's a freshman at Harvard, right?
I
And
mean,
and
what?
this is a planned child for the record. Like there are no accidents here, right? This is like married after grad school child who's a whole ass adult, right?
I
And
know.
charming and wonderful. And you're like, how did your friend produce this wonderful being? Because it
Right.
isn't now, right? But and so I think that so the context there is that you realize that you're aging and the role that you're playing in the work itself. I think what I'm also realizing very clearly is that you grew up and you were formed in a very specific context from a work perspective and from a world perspective. And so another example of that like hits close to home for me is that I'm out in California, my brother's in Atlanta, my sister's in Charlotte, and we were home about a year or so ago in New Orleans. I'm from New Orleans, like 7th-generation New Orleans native. My family's been in New Orleans since forever, 1791. And we were home for a trip to New Orleans, and my mother's so proud of how well the city's doing. And New Orleans is doing really well economically. It's bounced back amazingly since Katrina, which seems like a long time ago as well. And I think that also means that it looks different. And so my mother wants us to brag about the city, and because she wants us all to come home as all good mothers do. And my sister and I look up and we're like, yeah, the city looks great, but it is so white. New Orleans feels whiter than any New Orleans I've ever known before. And my mother says, without skipping a beat, yes, it now feels like the city I grew up in. And it's like jarring because I grew up in an 80% Black New Orleans because all the white people left, right? In the
Right.
60s,
Right.
right? And my mother grew up in a city that was like 50% Black, maybe 45%. New Orleans has always had a very vibrant and present Black community, but it was not the majority of the city. And the perfect example of that is that we all know the Ninth Ward is this neighborhood that was affected by Katrina, this Black neighborhood, working class Black neighborhood, generational Black wealth that was there, a working class perspective. We also know the story of Ruby Bridges, who was a Black girl who desegregated a school in the Ninth Ward. It was a Black girl segregating an all-white school in the all-white neighborhood that was the Ninth Ward in the 60s. My mother's the same age as Ruby Bridges, right? And so she has a very different perspective on the world and the place. And I never realized how much my 20 years, left when I was 17, but how that period really formed a perspective on space and place that sits with me that may shift, and how other people may grow up in places where those things are shifted as well. Like we joke as Gen Xers, how we've seen all these cities gentrified, right? Or I don't like to use the word gentrify, I call it suburbanization, because basically all these white folks coming in from the suburbs and living in cities and they've never lived in cities before and don't know how cities function and screaming about noise. It's like, welcome to the city, right? And so, but like what happens when you've actually grown up in those gentrified spaces, right? And your sense of DC isn't the U Street and Shaw that I knew when I was in DC in the 90s, but a fully gentrified DC, right? Where Shaw is this old school, wealthy Black neighborhood. Anyway, so all these things bring perspectives and normalizations of narratives that shift across the work. And when we were talking earlier, we were talking about really the importance of, honoring the generational shifts. I think that we're having a huge generational shift within the workplace right now, right? And we're seeing, and I'm going to be very candid here, we're seeing baby boomers are finally stepping down. God bless them. I don't know why they won't work this hard for this long, but they're finally stepping down from the role. And I joke as a Gen Xer that it's the millennials that are stepping into power, right? Like they're the next generation of leaders within organizations themselves. And as a Gen Xer, my job, there's a baton being passed, and my job is just to make sure that baton is not dropped. I ain't trying to hold the baton. Gen X does not want to be here. We really don't want to be here, but we have to, just the way the numbers work and the generational, we have to work for some years in leadership roles, right? And so we're thinking about really how do we, and those are two generations that think very, very differently,
So wait,
right?
let's pause here because I think it's really interesting. Do you think Gen X has a identity crisis? Like what what's
No,
it
I
for
don't
Gen
think
Xer to
Gen
do?
X, for the record, Gen X does not have identity crisis. Gen X is fine, completely fine. I think that Gen X has been overlooked for so long. We are so fine with being overlooked. We have no problems with that. I
Are we
think
like
that
the middle children of the generational
I don't even
family?
think that we're the middle child. I think that we're the neighbor's child that's invited to dinner occasionally. Right? And so, but I do think that Gen X holds a specific and an interesting spot in the sense that Gen X as a generation has always served at the will of another generation, right? When we were young professionals, we served at the will of baby boomers. We were all groomed under baby boomers. It's what the baby boomers needed, right? Like we have a sense, we've normalized a sense of leadership that comes with baby boomers, right? We then are now in a space where we're actually serving at the will of millennials and Gen Z folks. And what that means is that, interestingly enough, you work in spaces where there are demands from a work perspective that are seemingly, yes, I guess they're fine demands. I don't think that generations that come after us realize how much the workplace has shifted and how sincerely we as Gen Xers have tried to shape workplaces that do not repeat the toxic work environments that we worked in, right? And so this is where, you'll hear people mumble about, so at Bridgespan, but in different places where you work from a consulting perspective, oh, the workspace feels toxic. And it's like, oh, honey, you don't know a toxic work environment. Like
Right.
I got toxic for you, right? This is like so the opposite of toxic to some degree, but it's all about perspective, right? And so I think that there's something to be said about how do we, both as a generation, acknowledge and celebrate the progress we've made from a leadership perspective, from an organizational perspective, at the same time realizing that we're still on a path to developing a more critical and more engaged work environment. So there's that
Okay.
piece. I do
Okay,
think
wait.
go ahead, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Well, I want to pause here because full disclosure, I am at the tail end of Gen X. I have feelings about the young people. I think about Chuck Klosterman's book about the 90s, where he says every generation feels that the generation that comes after them is lazier and what is he? Lazier and more and softer. And he's like, but that's a good thing because we've created the context and the conditions by which their worlds are actually easier. And so it would be a problem if they were harder than we were. So I was like, okay, that's a good perspective. But I want to talk here about, and you know, I'm just going to say like data point of one, but like I felt really confused by my younger staff because I was like, I feel like you're asking me to do all of these things, therapist, mom, whatever. I'm your boss. Like I cannot be responsible for your emotional well-being. And yet I also feel like with this, there's like a therapy speak creep into the workplace. Like I feel triggered and I feel whatever. And I'm just like, I can't, I am here to be a boss to you and to tell you what to do. I am not here to be your mom or your therapist or all the things. So I don't know. What the
100.
question here
Well,
is like,
I
what
agree.
is happening?
What is happening? So I can tell you my perspective, once again, an N of one, right? My perspective on things. And what the perspective I'm sharing with you is, I am sharing how to move through the current situation, right? And so we can have another conversation with cocktails about, like, because it's a lot. It can feel like gaslighting to me. Like I have never felt like a Republican more than in conversations with young new staff, right? And
Oh,
then
I
this
know.
big black guy from New Orleans, right, living out in California, right? But literally sometimes the questions and requests, and so I'll give a very vivid example. I was having conversations with someone about an organizational dress code, right? And they were, oh, what's our organizational dress code? I was like, well, our organizational dress code is very straightforward. It's two principles: business casual and dress to match the formality of the client. The client's wearing a jacket, wear a jacket. If the client is wearing t-shirts and flip-flops, our rates are a bit too high for you to be walking around in t-shirts and flip-flops. I would suggest the polo and running shoes, right? And the client was, and the consultant or the associate consultant was asking from an equity perspective, particularly as a BGLAD, a member of the queer group, right, which I lead our affinity group. And they asked, well, what if I, as a cis male presenting, want to wear a dress to a client meeting? And I was like, once again, our dress code is business casual and dress to match the formality of the client. I would suggest going to Ann Taylor, not Forever 21. That's just me as a gay guy giving you sartorial advice, right? The dress code doesn't really have any perspective on that, right? And the pushback was, well, we don't really feel as if this dress code encourages us to live into our gender identity and gives us full permission to do that. And this is where I realized there was such a complete shift because one, I'm sitting here and I'm being like, well, I mean, I don't know how to tell you this, but like, you're coming out of college where you just paid someone for 4 years to affirm your identity. You're at a workspace where we pay you to develop deliverables, and we want you to be affirmed in your identity because you develop better deliverables. But we're not in the identity affirming business, right? And as I'm
That's
saying this,
right.
I'm like, good Lord, what kind of Republican like do I sound
I
like, right?
know,
Like
I know, I know. But
affirming,
and yet it's like it's true. Like
you get the two weeks
I
extra
had to like,
affirmation,
oh
right?
my
Like,
God, now this is gonna like devolve. But like I had to explain to a staffer why tights were not appropriate as pants. Like, and
but
particularly on a
yeah,
day that the board was coming into the office for a board meeting, I was like, it's just I don't know how to explain to you that tights are not pants. I don't know.
I do wonder though how much of that is talk about what we've normalized as good management and good leadership is not the same for different generation, and how what's requested of us may in some ways trigger things that we should be talking about with our therapists, right? So for me, Gen X, my parents basically went to work and dropped me off at my grandparents where I watched Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers. And my mother calls us all the time to figure it out, figure yourself out, figure it out yourself generation. We had to figure all this stuff out on our own. Like your parents would offer, I wouldn't call it advice. I wouldn't even call it guidance. They offered, encouragement, right? Like, oh, I'm sure you'll figure it out. Like that. That's my mother's advice for everything. Oh, tough choices. Sleep on it. I'm sure you'll figure it out, right? But that said, we became parents that were very directive, right? That were very hands on, and that whereas we found power in ambiguity and space, this generation, and I'm speaking in broad strokes for the sake of conversation, obviously, because there are exceptions in every rule, right? They want to see things. They need clarity in a way that we're not used to giving, and even feel gaslighted, right? To give, right? It's like, what do you mean? Like, I don't know, figure it out, right? And it's like, well, actually, no, like, let's stop and think about one, why that's triggering, and two, how that may in some ways be a gift of this generation, because I think it forces us to codify how we think about things and the work itself. And so that's one point. So I think that there's something around that piece. I do think there's, interestingly enough, and this is where I also feel gaslit, particularly with something like the dress code, like asking as a queer person, how do we engage the dress code? You are talking to a partner that on any given client meeting may be wearing a caftan or a bow, right? Like full on, blouse, right? And so for you to be asking me about like the dress code in a way as if I'm like pushing a problematic dress code, it's like, do you see, like, read the room, right? Like, and it's very easy. It makes you feel like the man all of a sudden. And it also doesn't recognize the fact that, yes, our dress code has two tenets because lesbians in the 80s have fought for you. The dress codes used to be extremely directive, right? Like women wore pantyhose and skirts and heels, couldn't even wear pantsuits, right? And so you're fighting where there's no fight, right?
Yeah,
Like, why are
yeah.
you fighting where there's no fight? Like, save your energy for a real fight here,
Okay,
right?
wait.
So it's a generation that really wants to engage and really wants to fight, but fighting in the wrong way, in my mind,
Yeah.
right? And so that's where
Okay.
it becomes really gaslighting as well.
Oh my God, so many things, Darren. Okay, wait. I also want to talk about I'm just gonna say it. I'm turning into this the weaponization of race.
Oh my goodness. The weaponization of race, let's stop there for a second. I do think we see across the sector, and I'm going to be very candid from a racial perspective. I think that we see, particularly within organizations that actually may not be the most diverse organizations, where organizations have made huge leaps in putting people of color, particularly Black women, in leadership roles, right, to lead. And now we have junior staff, particularly white junior staff, hijacking movement language against their Black manager. And this is
Yes.
like what the
Yeah.
is this really going on right now? Like, are you talking to me about equity? And are you talking like what? Like I mean, talk about gaslighting. You just sit back and you're like, wait, excuse me, right?
Like what
Like
rabbit hole did I just fall
you have
through?
a junior white staff person. I've seen this in organizations. A junior white staff person asking, why aren't their lived experiences being, appreciated? First of all, what lived experiences? Like that and like how do you say this in a way that's affirming? But like that internship in college only counts for so much, right? And also, like, are you discounting our lived experiences as, folks of color who are also in leadership roles. And so the profession, like I also have, like I'm a partner now at Bridgman, but I also have life experiences outside of that. So like when you're talking about this mystery man behind the curtain, that mystery man is me.
Yeah.
And when you act as if that mystery man is some white guy, like you're erasing me. Like you're erasing me, right? And so your acts of equity are actually a full erasure of people of color who fought hard to be in leadership positions. You're questioning leadership now that there's a person of color in a leadership role, right? It's just white supremacy showing up in a different way, right?
I I'm so glad you said it. Like actually, when I was an ED, I had a young woman leave the organization in her exit interview. She was like, "Well, I just really don't. I can't be in an organization where the executives are white." And I was like, excuse me? Like
Do you
I
not see me?
couldn't. Yeah,
What
well, and she didn't see me, right? And I think as an Asian person in America, it's
yeah.
interesting to try to carve out a space in a dialogue that seems so black or white, and the assumptions that she made about me being Asian and like my adjacency to white. Anyway, that's a
No, no,
whole
no,
other
you get
thing.
that, but
But
I mean, it's a whole whataboutism, right? So you get it as an Asian person, you get it, yeah, you're black, but you're gay, right? And as a gay person, you have wait, what's like, wait, hold on a second, what come again?
yeah,
Right? Or you're talking about black women in the space, and you're talking with a white woman who says, yeah, but you're a guy. And you're like, okay, yes, and come on now, you know, white women's been a little problematic there, right? There's a whole lot of tensions there. So like let's get it together here, right? So I think that there's the whataboutism, but I think that the whataboutism is basically a way of discounting who you are, erasing who you are, and more importantly, forcing that person into the role, like the critical role they shouldn't necessarily be in. So I think there's that piece. I think there's also a language around um, so two other points I want to drop, and then we can have a full conversation. Sorry, just like this is on my chest. So I'm glad, like you know. I think
this
there's
is why we love you, Darren. We just wind you up and let you go.
I know, right? I think there is, you know, this push for let me put it this way. We want to move towards a more equitable space. I think that we don't quite have a sense of what that should look like. And as a result, we're pushing on things that are tried mechanisms for equity, but they're not necessarily where equity should live out. So I think that there's, you know, you see it around the flattening of organizations, right? That people don't like hierarchy. I totally get the idea of hierarchy being problematic, particularly when you have, you know, when the people at the top are pale, male, and stale, right? You know, the way we've tried to navigate that is that by putting more people of color in leadership positions. And now that we actually have more people of color in leadership positions, you know, we're not giving them space to lead, right? We're not giving them space to change the organizations. We're not giving them the space to actually think through what the answer looks like. And I joke all the time that, you know, we're handing Black women particularly keys to condemned houses and expecting them to do a renovation that's going to give the house, bring the house up to code, right? When it needs a full-blown rebuild, right? And we're impatient with them. We don't give them the support that we need. So there's that piece. And we also know within organizations, we have these expectations of, oh, things should be more flat, decision making should be more shared. Have you ever tried to run an organization? I never understand people who want more decision making authority. I am happy somebody's over there doing decision making so I can do my job, right? And so I think there's, you know, people that like lanes exist in an organization for a reason. Just like, you know, you'll have people say things like, oh, I feel like there are power dynamics at play. Yes, there are definitely power dynamics at play, right? Like we have a hierarchy for a reason, right? Like there's certain decisions that you not only aren't capable of making, but you probably don't want to make,
Yeah.
right? And so how do you accept that without making that an equity conversation, right? So there's that piece which I think is um, really massive, something to talk about. Like how do you think about that? And how do you think through that? I think you know we're also trying to figure out um, as an organization if we're building towards a world that we haven't seen before. How do we give people the space to build? And then this sounds not complicated. It sounds esoteric and might not make sense. I do think, and I've shared this with my team before, that as a junior person professionally, my skill, my asset was in critiquing. like I would come into, positions before Bridgespan, you'd walk into a room of white people and just tear them up, right? You'd open up a deck and be like, yeah, I don't know what's on the other 40 slides in this document, but slide 5, bullet 3 is hella problematic. And we're going to spend our conversation talking about this. This is what's wrong. This is what I say no to. And as you become more senior, you realize that your flex is not in saying no, it's in what you say yes to. Your flex is not in tearing things down, it's in actually having the power to build things, right? And create things. But what happens when you've actually never developed that muscle? When the only skill you have is saying no, when the only muscles you developed are tearing things down, when you're invited to a table to build and you have no way of building, you don't know what that looks like. You've been so robbed of the space to build that all you know how to do is, deconstruct. And I joke all the time that there's something, we talk about people who are really good at punching up. When punching up becomes your only way of functioning and working, you're actually only affirming the hierarchy, right? Because you're constantly saying that, like, I'm here punching up to you, right? And one of my biggest flexes is saying, I really can't be bothered with white people half the time, right? Like, I just can't, like I'm out here trying to figure out my world without them. And that's a flex, right? Like that is a middle-class Black flex, right? Like literally where you want to create a world where you don't even have to be bothered with white people, right? That's why historical Black colleges are absolutely wonderful. That's why Black companies are absolutely wonderful. That's why very diverse organizations that is a hell of a flex, right? That's why our lesbian sisters are a flex, literally saying they're living in a world where they don't even need men, right? Like, and so I think that you have to think about the side flexes and how you're disrupting narratives in the work and not really affirming them. But you also have to figure out how do you find space to build, find space to create, and not operate from a place of marginalization all the time.
Okay. So many things. So are you referring to the millennials coming up who are in kind of like that punch up mode, and then all of a sudden they are the top person, right? Like they are the head. How do we deliberately create spaces where they're not sort of in opposition
Yeah,
to, but actually, like as you're talking, I'm thinking about building bridges, or
I think I'm 100%. I'm thinking about the millennials that are coming into power. How do we give them the space to actually lead? And by lead, I mean build and create. I think also, particularly for millennials of color who have come into power punching up, right? Who have come into power critiquing, who have come into power calling out white supremacist institutions for what's white supremacists. How do we give them space to not be anti something all the time, right? To talk about what the anti-world, like what's the opposite of anti this? Not the opposite of anti this, but what does that look like from a positive perspective, right? What does it look like to be anti-racist in a way where you're still not using racism as your counter, right? Like what is the opposite of that? What does the liberated world look like?
yeah,
And how do
I
we talk
love
about
that.
the world? Because I say all the time, and particularly within my podcast, the easiest way to disrupt a broken narrative is to create one and tell one that is more compelling and more beautiful, right? And so, what is that beautiful, compelling narrative that we're telling that drowns out the broken one in a way that we don't even refer to it anymore, right? We just live into the new one.
Well, and I also just want to pause here because I think too around the tendency to like focus on the minutia without seeing the big picture. Like I'm thinking of a colleague of mine who as a white woman was like, "What do I say when my largely staff of color tells me that deadlines are white supremacist?" It's like,
You say
I don't
that's
I don't know
garbage,
what
right?
to...
Like, no, I mean, you say that this is one that this is actually you're gonna trigger me with that one, right? Like this whole, I was in a conversation with someone that I love actually, Javier Torres, in the podcast. And it was totally towards the end of the podcast. And so, Ria, you know what it's like when it's like, oh, someone says something, you're like, oh, I could totally engage in that. But we got 2 minutes, right? And so I didn't really get into the conversation. But he was talking about his team, talking about deadlines being white supremacists, this idea of, or even internalized capitalism, right? And I was like, well, I mean, you're giving capitalism way too much credit here, right? Like, I mean, like being efficient, actually driving impact, like that for you as capitalists, right? Like, respecting some degree of urgency in the work. And no one's saying that you should be up sending emails at midnight, right? Telling people you need a response at 1:30. But it's completely fine to have some sense of deadlines in the work because you have to keep the work moving. right? And you have to respect other people's time as well. Like we're all working with time restraints, right? And so I think that we haven't figured out how to negotiate that in a way that doesn't force us back to the same old narratives that don't really get at what we're getting at. Um, I think there's, and also like, some of us are just faster and more efficient than others, right? Like how do we respect, and they're people of color that are faster and more efficient and quick thinkers, right? It's almost like the stop talking white, right? Like say, whoa, hold back for a second, right? Like that's just how I am. That's how I navigate. And so how do you, I want to respect what you bring to the conversation, but also how do you respect what I bring to the conversation? And I recognize, we have this all the time within the work itself. And I say this is a very proud extrovert, right? I think you want to be able to think about how do you respect folks that are extroverts and whatnot as well as respect folks that are introverts and not let, I mean, this is another conversation, but like not let that be the norm. So you definitely have to figure out how some folks may be rewarded more than others and how do you allow for, rewarding around other groups, but also let's not punish people for those things or call those things non-equity or non-BIPOC things because it's such like we're a diverse group of people with diverse needs and experiences. And so how do we actually live into that in a way that makes sense and is powerful? And so with that, I think that, the work does have to become quite personalized, right? And we saw this. I saw an organization where they were trying to figure out the work from home, the work in the office. I mean, this is a lot going on. People trying to. We are. Let's stop for a moment to capture the moment that we're in. We're living through some bullshit right now. I mean, just for the record, right? We had 4 years of a presidency that was at its best
Oh my
disruptive,
God.
right? Like that's the most charitable word I can call it. I mean, this is a president that made Reagan seem like a saint, right? And I'm not going to, but anytime folks are out here romanticizing Reagan, who was basically the devil, right? And if you're out here romanticizing Reagan, you can imagine how bad the person is, right? Followed by 3 years of COVID, right? And I don't know what's going on with COVID now, right? And then, honestly, I'm so fatigued, right? I followed all the rules. I've had like, I'm that Gen X that's had like 5 boosters, right? And then and then within that, we had a whole ass civil rights movement. We don't, we're going to look back at it and realize it. We had a whole civil rights movement, right? In
Yep.
2021, right? Where the narrative shifted tremendously, right? We haven't given ourselves credit for the narrative shift that happened, right? I think about within my work in philanthropy, this idea of having a philanthropic portfolio that only funded people of color in 2019 was radical as hell. Radical as hell. It took so much work to push that through. Now it's like commonplace. The narrative has shifted, right? There's pushback. Obviously, there's always pushback. But as my mom always says, if Florida's creating a law against it, the ship has sailed and we won, right? The
That's
second
good.
don't say gay, we're all saying gay is what that means. Like it's over with, right? And so I think that we're living through a period of transition with a generational shift, with a level of uncertainty, and with a higher bar around what work and equity and happiness looks like, right? And so it's chaos.
Well, and I would add with the inclusion of media
Yeah,
and the fear of saying anything because you will be canceled
yeah.
on social media. So like we haven't even given ourselves space to make mistakes, right? And
Well,
I'm not
that's
making excuses
yeah.
for
I
like,
wanted to get to that point, and that I
yeah.
meant to keep it up earlier. I think that piece around not having space to make mistakes is critical. And you ask, like, how do you support millennial leaders, right? We have to give them safe spaces to fail, right? Because I know as a professional that I grew the most with failures, right? It's when something goes completely wrong that you learn the most and you learn what not to repeat, right? And we've created a culture where success comes from constant winning, right? Like it's like, oh, I've done exactly what I was supposed to do in the forum and the performance development. Like it's time for me to get a promotion, right? And I know that I've grown the most when I failed miserably at what was expected from a performance development perspective, right? Like we all joke, like I still do a a spell check specifically for the word public because I've sent out a document where I forgot that L, right? Like and like and spell check didn't catch it, right? And so like I mean this is a small silly example, but like we all know there are things that traumatize us, right? Like And so I think there's something to be said about how do we get people the space to fail, and we don't have a culture that allows people to fail. I think that we live in a hype man culture as well from a social media perspective, and where there isn't a shared that there's I mean there's always with um, assets and growth areas there's some liabilities. I think that social media has given space for people to find communities that they didn't have before. And so you can be that gay black boy living in some small town in Arkansas, and you may not have friends in your neighborhood. Well, these days, I'm sure you do, right? Because the world has changed there too. But but you can find someone across the country that's in your community, and you can there's space for you to normalize who you are in a way that's powerful. That said, there's also space with that for folks to normalize very abnormal and problematic ways of living, right? Because just because you can find some bananas person across the country who thinks that your unique form of hate is normal, you can all of a sudden have a community around just really warped perspectives. And so we're seeing, particularly, I joked earlier about this, growing up, Gen X, I think that we should be called the Sesame Street generation because our parents set us down in front of Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers, and we thought that was normal. We thought everybody was holding hands, wearing natural hair, and singing songs, right? That shit was radical. That was radical as hell. We were coming to the civil rights movement,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so we normalized. I mean, Summer Bridge, break the code. That was radical thinking.
Radical.
Normalized the Summer Bridge.
Totally revolution. Yeah.
We
Yeah.
we normalized that. And so at some point you look up and you're like, oh my God, America's really not changing. It's like, what's going on around you? Like, no, actually, you were the one living in a Truman Show.
Yeah.
America's doing what America's always done.
Well,
Like,
and I just want to pause there too, because I think that there's something in the, I don't want to make this into like millennial bashing, but there's something about attributing being uncomfortable with being harmed. And like that is not the same thing. Like there are points in my life that I was deeply uncomfortable, and that's when I had the most growth. That's when I was forced to
well,
be outside of my
growth and learning only comes through discomfort.
right. And so how do we help them make that distinction of like just because you're uncomfortable does not mean you're being harmed.
Yeah. Well, I joke all the time. This is where talking about having to put on a therapist hat. And anytime Darren's putting on a therapist hat, the situation's bad, right? And I say this to a husband who is a trained therapist, right? But I think that very often when I'm talking with folks, both within the organization and more so outside of, I have to stop and ask them, are you struggling with actual anxiety right now? Or are you struggling with ennui? Right? Like, are you anxious? Are you harmed? Are you just kind of bored, right? Or unsettled, right? There are differences there. Like, it's almost like when you go to the doctor's office and they're like, on a scale of 1 to 10, like, where are you from a pain perspective, right? And I'm always like, I don't, 1, 2, I'm not feeling any pain, right? There's some people that are naturally at an 8. They just feel like there's a need, like everything, and getting them to stop and actually think about where they are, I think is really important because I think that people need to really be able to calibrate their levels of feelings around situations as well. I think it's also, and this is one that I really struggle with, because I think that we as a generation have to be able to make it clear to folks that life is a series of making shit up, right? We're all making it up as we go along without erasing our wisdom and knowledge and skills that we have, right? So I think we are just making up. We do have a bigger sack of tricks to pull from in making it up, right? We've seen things, we've lived things, and so we're all throwing stuff at a wall. We just have a whole bigger bag of spaghetti to throw at the wall to see what sticks, right? And that's a complicated because there's a level of humility in saying, oh, no, I really don't feel like what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing next time, right? But you do intuitively, you have some sense of what you're doing and how to navigate a situation. You're expertly skilled at being able to read the room, understand people, understand their starting points. You've seen enough people that you have a very different set of starting points. You understand how the person's processing the world, and you're making it up with those pieces in mind, but your assessment skills are just stronger, right?
Well, and the pattern recognition is just stronger. Like
Yeah.
just based on experience, like literally just being on the planet longer and seeing more of these sorts of situations happen. My pattern recognition skills tell me it's going to go this way.
My pattern recognition skills are on point, particularly as people of color and people from marginalized groups.
Right.
Like, you have to be able to, you need to walk into a room and suss it out fast. I mean, there's a reason that black people can black people can give you a black count intuitively,
I,
right? Like you go to a
I
white
do the
restaurant,
Asian count.
you go to a white restaurant
Yep.
and you see it in it. Well, don't do this because if you're not black, but if you go to a white restaurant and you see another black person in there, you can very easily walk up to that black person and ask them what's the black count, and they will tell you how many black people in that room. We've all done it, right? And so I think that we're able to, and also like our all skin folk ain't kin folk. You can tell if if they're your people as well, right? And so I think we have a certain set of skills from an assessment perspective that are true skills that we've gained intuitively. The art is being able to give people the ability to learn those skills, one, respect those skills, and then be able to unpack how you learn those skills in a way that doesn't diminish the importance of those skills and doesn't diminish the things that you develop from intuitive perspective, right? And so I think that why as we talked about Gen Z as a Gen X to Gen Z. Millennials, there's some stuff going on with millennials, but hell, in this moment, millennials are our allies. Like, because Gen Z, I really don't know what's going on, right?
I think we all will just retire before they actually hit the marketplace.
and it also, yeah, it makes me realize like I'm in an 8-year countdown. I'm trying to be out. Like I'm not trying to be working at 85 like these baby boomers, right? And so I think that it's really a question of how do we. The answer from a managing Gen Z perspective is rely on millennials to manage them because they're closer
Do
in
it. Yeah.
they're closer in thinking. So how do we give them the management skills to deal with Gen Z? Because my Gen X ass definitely should not be doing that,
No,
right? So
I'm with you, but it makes me think that there might be something interesting. Not that I'm asking you to enter this fray, but you know how like the skipping the generation often works, so you have like grandparents and grandchildren getting along much better than like the parents and the children. So I'm just wondering if there's a world where we are able to codify the wisdom and the mentorship without frankly the headache. Like I like to say about my nieces and nephews, all the fun, none of the responsibility. Like how do we get all the fun but none of the responsibility when it comes to these Gen Z babies who need to get raised up?
yeah, I yes, 100%. I also wonder how many of us that are Gen X technically, who I don't know, our parents were baby boomers. As Black folks, I think so many of us were actually raised by our grandparents who were a very different generation in a very different context. And so as a result, like we actually had almost an antiquated, I mean, in a good way, right? We have a very different way of seeing the world and respecting the world. And we also have an appreciation for older folks and generational learning in a way that was not interpreted or learned by the current generation. And so, but I think with all of this stuff, the answer becomes really trying to figure out what are the assets that people are working with and how do you honor those how you honor those assets in a way that they may be gaslighting at times, right? But it's what they have to work with, and so we have to figure out this it's what's in their cabinet
Yeah.
from a supply perspective. We cannot force them to cook from a recipe that where they don't even have the ingredients. Like what do
Yeah.
they have that they can work with, because we're about to be out. And particularly I think leaders of color, I know we're going way over just, but I think
Yeah.
also particularly leaders of color, we have to think about success not as within our generation, but generations to come. And so we have to think about the long game and how we're preparing people to exercise leadership in the long game. And yeah, so I think that's
Yeah.
all stuff.
That's such a generous perspective because I'm kind of like, all right, y'all, house is on fire. I'm about to be out. I'll be in volley. Don't call me. Yeah, no, but I think that that's right. Darren, this has been so fun.
This has been great.
I
Can I just close with a quick poem? So
Yes,
I love,
please.
normally I do an invocation, but I'll give you a benediction at this one. And this is one that I return to all the time as a reminder of my ancestral obligations. But it's a James Baldwin, nothing is fixed. Nothing is fixed forever and forever and forever. It is not fixed. The earth is always shifting. The light is always changing. The sea does not cease to grind down rock. Generations do not cease to be born. And we're responsible to them because we are the only witnesses they have. The sea rises, the light fails. Lovers cling to each other and children cling to us. The moment we cease to hold each other, the sea engulfs us and the light goes out. So through all of this and the triggering, we have to hold each other, and we have to support each other in the work because that's where the answer comes. So live into it.
Strap in. It's going to be a bumpy ride, but thank you, Darren. This has been awesome. As always, I will make sure that your information about your podcast and about you are in the show notes. Always good to see you, my friend.
Always good to see you. Thanks, Ray. This is wonderful.
All
Talk
right.
to you guys
All
later.
right.
Bye.
Bye.